Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales and to our event this evening. Our subject is Biden and the Middle East, a new beginning or same old. And our speaker is Dr. Anthony Billingsley of the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. After an earlier career as a diplomat with postings which included Beirut, Cairo, and Damascus, Dr. Billingsley has worked with Westpac, the Higher College of Technology in Abu Dhabi, and the Office of National Assessments in Canberra. He lectured in international relations at Macquarie University prior to his current appointment at the University of New South Wales, specialising in the Middle East and international law. Dr. Billingsley will speak for half an hour or so, following which we open the event up to questions, both from our small audience here in the hall, restricted as it is by COVID, and from our online audience. We encourage you to prepare your questions and feed them in the course of the address or at the end. So, without further ado, over to Tony Billingsley.
Well, thank you, Ian. I say it's nice to be back at Glover Cottage. I haven't been here for quite some time. The choice of the title of the talk was very deliberate because Joe Biden has promised us new beginnings, a new approach to international relations or to American foreign policy. I think I hope not just in response to Trump, but to a developing trend that we'd seen probably since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, in my talk, I'm going to be ignoring some very important issues. I'm going to be ignoring what I think are the top priorities for the United States administration, the issue of Putin and Ukraine and the hacking issues involved with that. And of course, the reasonably significant increase in Chinese interest in the region. I'll touch on that briefly, but those are sort of in the background. But I won't be dealing with them in any particular way. So I'm premising my remarks on the position that US policies towards the Middle East have been damaging to the cause of democracy in the region, to political stability, to economic growth, again, basically since 1989 or 91. The obvious starting point, of course, is the most obvious point of damage has been the 2003 invasion of Iraq by George Bush. But you can see in earlier administrations examples of cynical, ill-informed, maybe ideologically driven policies, those that support dictators as their preferred form of governance, their focus on providing support to the armed forces as opposed to civilian institutions. So in Egypt, the vast majority of US aid goes to the armed forces, not to organizations designed to promote democracy. So the failure of the Iraq occupation, I think, was where we saw the beginnings of a retrenchment of the United States from the region. US public opinion was deeply hostile to continuing the war there. And I think that this has continued through Obama, through Trump, and Biden will continue this steady path away from direct military intervention in so many of the countries. Nevertheless, I think the US will remain the most significant player in the region. It will remain important in any attempts to bring stability to the region, to the Middle East, and to come to terms with some of the problems that have been besetting the region for such a long time. Now, I guess the hopeful side is if you look at the domestic approach that Biden has taken. He promised a new approach, and I think what we're seeing there is policies that match that promise, with a rupture between the link that developed between Friedmanite economics and liberal political liberalism, Domestic policies now have a fairly distinct Keynesian tinge to them. And the Middle East, of course, is not quite so clear-cut because, Biden told us, for example, that he was going to be, in the election campaign, he was going to be tough on the Saudis. He was quite ruthless in describing Mohammed bin Salman as a thug. He promised to return the United States to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That is what I call the Iran nuclear agreement, involving the Security Council members, the EU, Germany, China, Iran, sorry. And he would promote human rights throughout the region. And of course, very importantly, I think, and the Europeans would be happy to hear it, he promised to consult his allies and friends before he developed his course of action. Now, it is early days, and Biden is still, I suppose, approaching 100 days, I think, still trying to settle in his team, for example. Policies take time to develop, but of course, problems don't wait. They develop much more quickly. And this is especially true of the Middle East. I think Biden's heart is in the right place. But I am a little bit concerned about the structure of his administration. So a lot of the advisors he's brought in to help him on Middle East and other issues are what are called the liberal-imperialists, the people who emerged out of that period of hubris after 1989, when the US was the sole power, if you like, but whose hubris basically contributed, I think, significantly to the situation the region now faces. Some of these advisors have already come under criticism for being too close to the Saudis, others for being too close to the Iranians. And I guess that sort of criticism is to be expected. But he's also encountering a very forceful campaign, especially in the context of the Iran nuclear deal, which I'll talk about later. So the Netanyahu government has come out very strongly in opposing it. And he's been supported by groups like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, this organization, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, which is an Iranian fairly murderous sect, which somehow or other has managed to buy its way into favor in the US. And other groups like Christians United for Israel, which is a very important organization in the United States, and of course, they're members of Congress. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is Biden and all the other parties involved feeling their way towards the formulation of policies, seeing what will float, what won't, seeing how far they can push their positions. Biden has already, I think, qualified some of his remarks that he made during the election campaign. He softened his position on the Saudis, and he seems to be lagging House Democrats as far as arms sales to the Saudis are concerned, and to the UAE. He's just approved the significant sale of arms to Egypt, which is suffering under perhaps the worst dictator that the country's ever experienced. So those are not necessarily encouraging signs. On the other hand, apparently he's about to announce the US's recognition of the Armenian genocide, which will provoke angst in Turkey, obviously, but may actually have a long-term benefit in that relationship. He has announced that he's restoring something like $200 million a year to the Palestine Authority and to aid programs there. And he's also said he will permit the PLO to establish an office in re-establish an office in Washington. So I think, as I say, I think his heart is in the right place and he's genuine about democracy. And I think what happened on the 6th of January, the attack on the Capitol, probably reinforces that determination on his part. Of course, political reality is something that he has to deal with all the way. So I want to turn to some of the major crises in the region: Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and of course, at the heart of it all, I'll argue, Iran. They're different problems in many ways, but their consequences have been devastating for the people of their countries and beyond the region as well. So just looking at Syria, there hasn't been a lot coming out about Biden's ideas about Syria. He criticised Trump for withdrawing troops, saying that he was betraying the Kurds and other Syrian groups that had put their faith in US support. Some members of the administration have been urging him to try to re-establish a physical military presence in Syria. And we have had 2 instances now of the US bombing Syria. But I think that the opportunity for the Americans to establish a major position in that country has perhaps passed. We may have to accept the Russian line that Assad has won and that we just have to put up with it. Of course, Assad then has to negotiate his relationship with the Russians and with Iran. But I think the reason I'm saying that is because I think the Russian position has become so solid in that country that there really is no possibility of the US offering itself as an honest broker to try to help get out of this disastrous situation that the Syrians find themselves in. Perhaps a glimmer of hope, but one of the US's more important allies in the region, the United Arab Emirates, has just opened an embassy, its embassy in Damascus. Now, this could mean that here is a potential alternative source for redevelopment aid, and so that the Syrians don't have to rely so much on the Russians, and certainly not on Iran, which is really not in a position, I think, to provide the sort of aid that Syria will need. Biden may also be seeing Syria in the broader context of a regional set of negotiations stemming out of the Iran nuclear deal. Iran being very important in this process as being one country that does have a commitment to the integrity of Syria. I'm sorry, I'm really going to race through these because I suspect I'm going to go over time if Ian will allow me. So talking about Iraq, it's a problem. It's a big problem for Biden. He has form there. So he did support the American invasion of Iraq. And I think now he seems to be conflicted about what he wants to do and how he wants to deal with it. Just recently, the deputy US ambassador to the UN told the Security Council, and I'll quote, among its top priorities, the United States will seek to help Iraq assert its sovereignty in the face of enemies at home and abroad by preventing an ISIS resurgence and working towards Iraq's stability. That means facilitating free and fair elections, plus fighting Iran-linked militias and terrorist groups like the Islamic State, as well as funneling money towards economic development, humanitarian improvements, and the elimination of corruption. Now, they're pretty big objectives. They're impossible objectives, at least in one generation, it seems to me. But he's out there as having said it. During the election campaign, Biden, however, promised to end the forever wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Staying entrenched in unwinnable wars, unwinnable conflicts, only drains our capacity to lead on other issues that require our attention. And it prevents us from rebuilding the other instruments of American power. And consistent with that, as vice president, he opposed the Obama's surge in Afghanistan. He was against the regime change policy in Libya, and generally was adopting a more cautious approach to American engagement in the region. But his ambassador's comments would suggest a more indefinite timeframe. Now, such a decision would certainly unite the Iraqis, would do little, I think, to resolve the country's problems. Again, I suspect that he may be hoping to see Iraq addressed in a broader context involving Iran, which also has an interest in the integrity of the country. In fact, a very clear interest in the integrity of the country. But I think Iraq's future is going to be very much affected by relations between the United States, Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, with poor old Iraq sort of in the middle of it all. On the 4th of February this year, Joe Biden gave his first foreign policy speech. He did it, as I think is probably traditional at the State Department, entitled America's Place in the World. And there he announced 3 decisions, I suppose you'd call them, with regard to his policy towards Yemen. This included the end of all support for offensive operations, including arms sales, US support for the US-led peace initiative, and appointment of an experienced diplomat as special envoy. Now, this has been interpreted by people as saying that the US is backing away from the support for the Saudis and is looking to present itself as an honest broker who can bring the various parties together. That it's a big break from the policies of the 2 previous administrations, which turned a blind eye to Saudi atrocities in Yemen and atrocities by others as well. Now, this is nice as it sounds, but again, there's this sort of element of ambiguity, of lack of confidence or surety about what he seeks to achieve. I mean, what are offensive operations? He promises to provide arms to help the Saudis, which can be used in defensive or offensive contexts. He's decided to go ahead with the arms, so that's in spite of having imposed an arms freeze at the beginning of the year. And the arms freeze, which forced the Saudis in particular to start rethinking their policy towards Yemen, their behavior in Yemen. I was talking to the interns earlier, and I rather cynically mentioned that there should be no connection between Biden's decision to sell arms to the Saudis and the Emiratis and the fact that the 5 largest weapons manufacturers in the world are all American. But that was an unnecessarily cynical response. But I think we're seeing those 2 countries starting to move, starting to take actions, a range of actions, which reflect an awareness that American policy is changing. They've said they're willing to join negotiations over ending the war, although the Emiratis are still causing trouble down in the south by supporting separatist groups down there. Another problem with the 3 points that that Biden mentioned in his speech was that the UN plan, which he says he supports strongly, and US policies have failed in part because they refused to recognize the Houthis as having a valid set of grievances, a valid claim to a place at the table in Yemen and in any peace talks. So the original UN plan completely excluded them, and their response was to take up arms. So up until now, the US has tended to lump the Houthis into the bucket of Iranian puppets, which is not really the case. And they have tended to ignore those genuine grievances. I can't see as yet. Oh, and the other point was that the diplomat that he's chosen is the same person that was being criticized publicly for being too close to the Saudis. So I can't see yet any sign that they're going to be moving on a way that will give satisfaction to the Houthis in future negotiations. Now, it seems to me anyway that and I may be exaggerating this, but all roads lead in this issue in the direction of Iran and the nuclear agreement. Along with Israel, Iran is the dominant regional power, and those two states are engaged in competition, competition which occasionally, as we've seen recently, can turn violent. But it is, I think, probably an inevitable aspect of the region's political future and something that has to be managed. Now, in dealing with honouring his promise to rejoin the nuclear agreement, Biden has a very difficult task ahead. As I said earlier, the opponents to the deal are working assiduously to try to sabotage any sort of diplomatic action that the Americans might pursue. And we should remember that there aren't too many votes to be won in midterm elections in the United States on being soft on Iran. So it is a very challenging domestic and international issue for Biden. Obama and Trump, Obama unconsciously, Trump quite deliberately made Biden's task particularly difficult by imposing interlocking sets of sanctions that are going to be very difficult for the administration to unravel. At one level, Biden has said, okay, we will rejoin the agreement when Iran reverses the various violations of the agreement that it has committed. Iran has said the exact opposite, that it will reverse those violations when the United States returns to the agreement and removes its sanctions. And this was brought home at the recent talks in Vienna, when the Iranians adopted a very strong and I think very confident position in the talks. Confidence, I think, strengthened by the Israeli attack on Natanz and by Netanyahu's boasting about it. And I think that weakened the US and the West and the European position in the negotiations. But just to give you an idea of the complexity of these sanctions. So they've been imposed on Iran for alleged nuclear violations, for alleged missile violations, for support for terrorists, for human rights violations. There must be many more, but they're the sort of the headline ones. And as I said, they're interlocking. So if you take the National Iranian Oil Company, which is a major source of foreign income for Iran, it's had sanctions imposed for supporting groups that the United States doesn't like. And that's a very long list. It's also being sanctioned for having provided funding for the nuclear program. So you've got two different things that are running across each other. And this can be applied to Iranian banks, to Iranian shipping lines, and other instrumentalities. Now, somehow or other, the administration could isolate individual sanctions and take them away, but the nuclear agreement said that this shall be to the benefit of the Iranian economy. And if the remaining sanctions don't really make any improvement in the economy, then there's no reason why the Iranians would be particularly pleased by that. I think Iran definitely feels less vulnerable than it did when Barack Obama imposed sanctions on wide-ranging ones, but on the financial system in particular. Trump's maximum pressure tactics failed to achieve regime change or even to extract significant concessions on the part of the Iranians. Instead, we've seen the position of the hardliners strengthened and that of Rouhani and like-minded moderates undermined. And surveys suggest that the Iranian population doesn't want their government to negotiate with the West or in the context of the nuclear deal until the US returns. They blame the Americans and the West for the plight that they're going through. And I think they do not trust the Americans to honor their promises. Interestingly, I think the Iranians have also developed import replacement strategies. They've perfected the art of bypassing sanctions. And generally, their economy has started to pick up much more than people expected at the beginning of the year. They've also been promoting relations in the East with the various stands. And whilst they're not Europe or the United States, they do something in terms of moderating the impact of the West's refusal to deal. And of course, we've now got this agreement announced last month, a further boost to Iranian confidence, I suppose, or at least to their ability to negotiate with the China deal, 25-year agreement, which will involve massive investment. I mean, I've seen figures of $400 billion. I don't see how the economy can handle that, but the numbers are big anyway. But you know, their infrastructure, industry, economic, petrochemical services could all benefit from this. And there may also be the military and intelligence, counterterrorism cooperation, which would link Iran more closely to the Belt and Road Initiative. And the others are watching, the other countries in the neighborhood are watching this. So we've seen the UAE and we've seen the Saudis quietly beginning negotiations with the Iranians. Now, the Saudis are a little bit different in this, but the Emiratis have always had a significant Iranian element in the population. Bahrain has, well, Shia, if not Iranians. Kuwait has Iranians, and so it goes. So the need for these countries to have some sort of relationship with Iran, I think, is becoming much more difficult to resist. I should note I've ignored Afghanistan in all of this because I don't regard Afghanistan as really part of the region. I tend to stop it at the eastern border of Iran. But I think the impending American retreat from that country is the one area in which the Americans have been able to really worry the Iranians. Taliban and Iran have always been sworn enemies. They were engaged in conflict well before the Americans invaded the country. There are many Afghan refugees in Iran. A lot of them are Hazara, which adds to this idea of a victorious Taliban not looking kindly on Shia and Shiite Iran in particular. The Iranians have been working to try and improve their standing in Afghanistan, dealing with the government, but also trying to come up with some sort of joint security strategy with Tajikistan, which is also equally concerned by the emergence. I'm assuming that Taliban is going to sweep through Afghanistan when the Americans go. I may be mistaken there, but the record is not encouraging. Am I going?
5 minutes.
Okay. No. Another area I wanted to talk briefly about was Israel and Palestine. Palestine has fallen off the international agenda to a great extent, in particular following I think the disasters of Obama's forays into the issue. And I think they just basically said, well, we won't touch it anymore. Biden seems to want to revive the negotiating process. The real cynics like me argue there never was a negotiating process, but maybe one can be developed. And as I mentioned, he's resumed aid and letting the PLO re-establish in Washington. The US is never going to abandon Israel. It's always going to be generous in its support, as far as I can see, at least in the foreseeable future. But the Netanyahu government's almost total identification with the Republicans in the United States may mean that the administration will be a little bit more insistent on Israel participating in negotiations in good faith. The obvious slight to Biden when Israel bombed the nuclear facility in Iran, at the same time as the Secretary of Defense was in discussions in Israel, will have reminded Biden that when he was vice president in 2016, he was in Israel negotiating on settlements, and Netanyahu pulled a similar trick on him. So that won't go down well with the president. On the other hand, this is such a difficult problem. I can't see Biden trying to move very quickly on this. He's got other issues anyway. And so I don't have many hopes for progress on that. Now, what can Biden hope to achieve in his 8 years as president that would materially affect the future of the region, the nature of the region, all the problems that are there? And I haven't touched on the environment, which is catastrophic in a number of the countries, including Iran. But to me, everything hinges on this nuclear agreement. To return to the agreement will, I think, and if it can be done quickly, because there are elections coming up in Iran, help to undermine, weaken the position of the hardliners, and perhaps give some support to the moderates. Rouhani can't stand again, but a moderate candidate. It would add to a process of opening Iran out to the outside world, not treating as a pariah. I think Iranians have often been criticized for being paranoid. They are surrounded by enemies because they are different from everybody else in the region. And anything that can sort of take away that sort of sense of threat, I think is probably a very good thing for the region and for Iran. And I should insist that Iran has always acted in a very rational, well, putting aside the revolution itself if you want, but has otherwise acted in a rational way in terms of its relations with its neighbors, with the United States. It's known how far to push. It's backed off when necessary. And I can't see any reason why it wouldn't react rationally even now. I think, in fact, the time, despite all the turmoil in the region, the time is probably propitious for some sort of initiative carefully prepared by the Americans. The countries are still reeling from the Trump effect. They're still very concerned about the US, but also about their own futures, because so many of them have been and continue to be reliant on US military support, the security umbrella that the US provides. And I think there's a feeling in Middle Eastern countries that people are becoming, well, we know from 2011 that people are fed up with the system, that the countries are still on the point of revolution. It is taking very severe tactics to hold people in check in Egypt and places like that. So it seems to me that the model that was adopted for the Iran nuclear deal provides a model that could be applied to a broader regional process. It involves all the parties who have an interest in a solution. The Iran nuclear deal Obama didn't involve the Saudis and others, and he had to placate them, and not very successfully by the look of things, I think. But the idea would be to promote some sort of regional security structure the Middle East has never had anything of that kind. It's had systems imposed on it by the Americans, CENTO, for example, but no system whereby parties in the Middle East can come together and work out their problems without resort or the threat of resort to force. Now, it's a pretty remote possibility when you're going to try and get countries like Israel and Russia and Iran and Egypt in at the same table. But if anybody has the capacity to bring those countries together, it could only be the United States. China, I think, is much too limited in its involvement. Russia, I think, has gone about as far as it can go in Syria, and it's not, even though they've been trying to chat up the Emiratis and other Gulf countries. And I guess finally, Ian, finishing, another important for Biden, I think, is for him to continue the process of getting out of the region. Not along the lines of the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think, which almost sounds like the betrayal that Biden accused Trump of in the context of Syria. In that way, he's going to be increasingly forcing the countries of the region to take responsibility for their own problems and to deal with each other. And at that, I think I better stop.
Thank you very much, Tony. We now come to questions. For those of you watching online, please use the question function on your Zoom screen. And for those of you here in the room, please use the microphone just here. So our first question would be from Richard Panofsky, please.
Tony, thank you for a very nuanced look at the region. Several of the points you made hadn't really occurred to me, but I'd see that they are logical. On Iran, can I just say, before I ask a question, that the JCPOA was a completely sensible idea. It had the support of the Europeans, of all the members of the Security Council, except for the United States and Israel. I don't see why it should be so difficult to get back to it if Biden has the strength and the courage, the moral courage to do so. He shouldn't be held hostage to the Christian right in the United States or Israel. It is a sensible idea. What's the alternative? Iran, as you said, feels paranoid. They're surrounded by nuclear powers, by Russia, by China, by the United States Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, by Israel, for goodness sake, and by Pakistan and India. There would be, I think, in my sense, on the right wing in Iran, a feeling that because the Americans have pulled out of a very sensible agreement under which we are bound by sanctions and by surveillance from the IAEA, there would be those who say, all right, bugger it, let's go nuclear. And they might well do that. If that happened, I think that you'll have a nuclear conflagration in the region, not kinetically, but the Saudis would go nuclear, so would Egypt, so would others. So the stakes are very high. But my question to you is, and it's a fundamental one, do you believe that the pro-nuclear weapons factions in Tehran would have the capacity to overthrow what has been a very logical, conservative policy in Tehran that says we will not go nuclear weapon, we simply want nuclear reactors along the Gulf? The Shah wanted 23, they've got one.
Well, Richard, thank you. One of the reasons that Iran went to the negotiating table, first of all, they made several offers. Even Ahmadinejad made specific offers to the Americans to resolve all their problems, in the course of negotiations, and they were summarily dismissed by the Americans. So Rouhani was the first one to be involved in that. Now, he has always been committed. He's now moving out, and he's maybe not quite a lame duck, but getting close to it. The other thing that happened at the time of the agreement was that there'd been elections and the people had spoken and said, we want Rouhani, and that means we want the nuclear deal. Now, I hesitate to describe Iran as a democracy. But there are certain democratic elements in there, one of which is the process of elections, which enable people to get the message across to the hardliners that this is what we want, and if you don't comply, there's going to be a problem. It's not like that now. The hardliners have been strengthened inexorably by Trump and Obama to an extent, because soon after the agreement was reached, he then imposed more sanctions. So it's a little bit different, but I still think that the Iranians, the fact that they've been to Vienna and have talked, not to the Americans, they refuse to deal with them direct, but the fact that they're talking, I think, is a good sign. It means that, I mean, why would you bother if there's nothing to stall for? Just let's get on with it. So that's an encouraging sign to me.
Do we have a question online? Okay, let's hear it.
Yes, our first question is, will the Western Sahara play out in this game, and with specific regard to reversing Trump's recognition of Morocco control over the area and for Morocco opening up to Israel?
Well, that's a fairly esoteric question. Most people probably don't know about the Western Sahara, but it's a fascinating story of a small Arab society being overwhelmed by a larger society, with settlements being built and population being brought in to overwhelm the demographic balance of the country. And of course, I'm not talking about Israel here, I'm talking about Morocco. The Moroccans have been in control since the mid-70s, I think it is, and have steadfastly refused to comply with UN resolutions and American pressure, although the Americans have tended to favour the Moroccan line anyway. I've not seen anything from Biden on Morocco, and I suspect it's so far down, or Western Sahara, so far down the list of priorities that it will come out. It may have come out in the America and the World, but I don't remember seeing it there. So it's not an important one. The Sahrawi, as they're called, have very few tools at their disposal, the only one really being Algeria. And to an extent, their fortune is tied up with relations between Morocco and Algeria. And at the moment, things are in stasis, I suppose. There's nothing happening either way.
Next question.
Thank you very much for that talk. I'm going to move a bit away from Iran and talk about perhaps a overlooked player in the Middle East, which is Jordan. And recently there's been quite the scandal in Jordan in the royal family. So I wanted to get your insights. How stable do you think the Jordanian regime is, and what implications does it have if it continues down this path of turmoil for the greater Middle East? Thanks.
For old Jordan, it's one of my favourite countries, but it's always on the knife edge. And as I've been told by countless Jordanians, we've got the Saudis bearing down us at one side and the Syrians bearing down on the other. So, and of course, Jordan is 70% Palestinian origin, the population. So the royal family, which has a certain cachet, relies on the tribes and relies on them to dominate the armed forces and key ministries. The issue that came up with Hamza, the son of King Hussein, who was not arrested, he always had close connections to the tribes, as did his father. But the current king does not. The tribes don't really like him. And so when Hamza went and sat down and had a chat to tribal chiefs, it's not surprising if the king said, hang on, what's going on here, and demanded a reaffirmation of loyalty. The country hasn't been going long enough to see, with the exception of King Hussein's father, who was insane and had to be committed. We've not seen any change of leadership apart from the natural process. So at the moment, the system, the king manages to hold things together, largely by relying on the tribes. And I think the Palestinian, these are people who came over in the 1920s or even earlier. I think they're happy enough with the system. They get on with business. They're left alone. The threats to the monarchy are from Salafist groups. And the government has had to respond very strongly to some of those. But I think it's in everybody's interest to hold the thing together. You know, you don't want the family breaking up, because then the tribes start to break up and suddenly your power base is undermined.
Another question from in the room.
Thanks very much for your talk, Dr. Billingsley. Could I put two questions to you? First of all, you pointed to the significance of a tendency for some of the Arabic states, particularly in the Persian Gulf, to increasingly understand they need a good relationship with Iran. How then do you reconcile that with the same states recently softening their attitude to Israel? That's the first point. The second point is, I feel you don't take sufficient account of the goal of non-proliferation in the whole Iranian nuclear issue, not just on the part of the United States, which has a long history of this, but also on the part of the European states and probably China too in the background. There's a tendency for them to want to draw a line. And whether that line is fair in some abstract sense is another matter. But clearly they see the Middle East as a crunch point in the whole issue of the spread of nuclear weapons. Turkey, for instance, has made it clear that if Iran goes nuclear, so will they. And probably the same applies to Saudi Arabia. So in essence, it's all about the credibility of talks with Iran in curbing the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. And this whole issue of the Iranian nuclear issue hangs on that. So have you taken sufficient account of that in American policy and perhaps in the policy of the wider group of countries that are involved in the nuclear talks with Iran?
Sorry, before you go, what was your first question again, please?
First question.
What was the first question?
Oh, about the increasing thaw in relationships between.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, so just on that particular point, look, I think part of the issue there is that it's very important for them to have the Americans on side. And I think probably Donald Trump just said to them, look, it'd be a good idea if you were to negotiate with Israel or become friends with Israel, because if you want to be friends with us, that's part of the package. When I lived in the Emirates, I remember having to organize a conference, and the Sheikh, the Minister of Education who I worked for, said, all right, now, can we invite some Israelis? Now, it's not my place to tell a Sheikh what to do, but I spluttered in shock and horror and said, you can't do that. It's against it's embargoed by the Arab League. And he sort of said, I also had spent time in Oman and wandered around, and there were Israelis wandering around all over the place. So what happened there was pushing on an open door. I mean, basically, the Emiratis have always been keen on establishing a relationship. They probably see themselves a little bit in the same circumstances as Israel, threatened by the Saudis, worried about the Iranians, that sort of thing. So I don't see there's any inconsistency there. I think they're looking at where their interests lie. What are the threats? If we find ourselves exposed with no American, Americans siding up to the Iranians, and remember, it wasn't that long ago when the Americans and the Iranians were great mates. So I think that's all that's going on there. On the question of proliferation, it's such a big one. I agree absolutely with you that everything to me hinges on the way these talks, this process goes, that the Americans go in, that they can maybe improve it, maybe they can expand it, or they can take it broader. We've had a long process of attempts to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Of course, this all falls down on the question of Israel's non-possession of nuclear weapons. We know they've got them, but of course, for Israel, they can't acknowledge it, because if they do, then everybody else has to respond. So it's better just to leave it quiet. But this is a problem. If you have a nuclear weapons-free zone, you have to have inspections. So it is a very, very difficult issue to deal with. At the moment, things are okay. The Iranians are not interested in nuclear weapons. I'm convinced of that, and they haven't been for 15, 18 years. 2003 was when they are thought to have given up any thought of that. And the other countries are happy just, Israel could have used nuclear weapons, for example, in 1973, when they were cut in half almost by the Syrian army coming down from the south. And they didn't. Now, partly because they had superior armed forces anyway, but that was an absolute threat to the homeland, and they refrained. And I think the other countries have sort of looked at that and said, provided it doesn't expand, other countries get the weapon, then we're not going to either. And I hope that's the way it goes. But it has to be dealt with somehow or other.
Do we have some online questions, please?
So we've got 3 questions each about China in the Middle East, so I'll go through them. What do you think will be China's strategy in the Middle East beyond just Iran, and how will it shape US involvement, particularly on Biden's claims of a pro-democracy and pro-human rights foreign policy? Can you comment more broadly about how China views the whole picture of the Middle East? And will the updated Iran-China relationship make Iran a proxy of China to increase its influence in the Middle East? And if so, will the Middle East become a new arena for US-China competition?
Okay, you're going to have to repeat them all. The first one was?
The first one was, what do you think China's strategy in the Middle East will be going forward?
Okay, and I think that relates to another one. I think China has decided that Iran is a pretty good catch, and it's not going to go beyond that. I don't think China is particularly interested in getting involved in the mess of Palestine, for example, or Egypt or any of those countries. Iran is there on the line of the Belt and Roads Initiative. It sort of fits the if you like, the historic pattern of trade going across east to west. So I think that is probably, it gives them a foothold, gives them a voice at the table. They've already got it because they're Security Council member anyhow, but it gives them a much more substantial standing in the Middle East. I mean, much as Russia really only has one party that it could claim to have a close relationship with. Now, in the case of Syria, you could say that it's verging on a proxy. I don't think, this is another question I think was asked, I don't think that Iran would become the proxy of anyone. I think we've seen this over the last 20 years or so. They are just not going to give in to anyone. And I think they'll be very, very careful how they deal with the Chinese relationship. and will manage to control their own destiny in that respect. And there was a third one.
The third
Or have
one
I covered them?
was more broadly about how China sees the region.
It didn't see the region until relatively recently. I mean, oil has been the focus. The oil from Iran and elsewhere has been what it is interested in. And so you had the string of pearls, which sort of addressed the sea lanes going across. But I don't think China really wants to get itself into the mess that the Americans have got into, for example. There's a theory in international relations about a superpower being a power that has complete control over its neighborhood so that it can then turn its attention elsewhere. And I don't think China could claim that at this stage. And I think that's another reason for them just to say, we've got a strategic position there, we will hold that, but we're not going to push it too far.
We've got time for 2 more questions. Is there one from the room? And in that case, what have we got online?
Now I have a question here. Given our earlier contested commitments in the region, what role, if any, do you see Australia playing in this theatre in the Biden era, be it in the Strait of Hormuz, Yemen, Afghanistan, post-withdrawal, Syria, and most importantly, to what justification?
Well, I'd like to say none, except for development support. But of course, we'll do what we're told. I'm sorry, I'm being very cynical, but I think Australia's involvement in the Middle East has only reflected our interests insofar as we see it as supporting, as drawing ourselves closer to our great and powerful friend, whoever that might have been. Now, given that Biden looks like he's pulling back, we're out. I mean, we are out anyway, basically. And I can't see any particular role for us. If there were to be a conflict, and if there were to need to have peacekeepers, well, okay, we've done that in the past throughout the Middle East. We're in UNDOF and all those other organizations, and that's a role to be proud of, I think. But to get involved in the bombing of Syria or what for, we really need to look at our own interests. And I think the Australian government now is so much focused on China that I'd be surprised to see any substantial assets going over to the region once the Americans start to really pull out.
Many thanks, Tony. I'd like to remind everyone, both live and online, that we have an event next week to be addressed by Dr. Meriden Barrell on the Chinese middle class and its role in China's future. But meanwhile, to round off this evening, I'd like to invite one of our interns, Adjoa Asan, to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Billingsley, for your address to the Institute this evening, titled Biden and the Middle East, A New Beginning or Same Old. You have shared with us your insights into the complexity of the region, particularly focusing our attention to the crisis in Yemen, the seemingly lost Syria, Iraq, Iran, and the challenge of a nuclear deal, Afghanistan, and the Palestine question. Our minds were directed to the recalibration of approach to the Middle East under the Biden administration, which has indicated its intention to avoid past errors, including invasion and regime change. However, you did note that there are liberal imperialists within Biden's ranks that may present some difficulties. You provided thoughtful answers to questions regarding the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, to which you highlighted the significance of talks at Vienna, the Western Sahara, Jordan, Israel's capacity to establish consistent relationships with other states in the region, non-proliferation, China, and Australia's speculative role in the region, It is undoubtedly clear from your presentation that international peace and security greatly depends on the stability of states within the Middle East. How the new American administration will attempt to repair somewhat irreparable breakdowns in trust in the region does indeed, as you suggested, significantly depend on Biden's creative and independent capacities, which you innovatively suggested could take the form of an unprecedented regional security structure. Please join me in thanking Dr. Billingsley.